Bhagavad Gita, as it is, Chapter 13. Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. Text 1 through 2. Arjuna uvacha prakritim purusham cheva kshitram kshitrajanam evacha etad viditam ichami jananam janeyam cha keshava. Shri Bhagavan uvacha idam shariram kontiyam kshitram itya vidyante etadyo viditam prahau kshitra jena iti tadvita. Translation. Arjuna said, "O my dear Krishna, I wish to know about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, and the field and the knower of the field, and of knowledge and the end of knowledge." The blessed Lord then said, "This body, O son of Kunti, is called the field, and one who knows this body is called the knower of the field." Purport. Arjuna was inquisitive about Prakriti, or nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, Kshetra, the field, Kshetrajana, its knower, and of knowledge, and the object of knowledge. When he inquired about all these, Krishna said that this body is called the field, and that one who knows this body is called the knower of the field. This body is the field of activity for the conditioned soul. The conditioned soul is entrapped in material existence, and he attempts to lord over material nature. And so, according to his capacity to dominate material nature, he gets a field of activity. That field of activity is the body. And what is the body? The body is made of senses. The conditioned soul wants to enjoy sense gratification, and according to his capacity to enjoy sense gratification, he is offered a body or field of activity. Therefore, the body is called Kshetra, or the field of activity for the conditioned soul. Now, the person who identifies himself with the body is called Kshetrajana, the knower of the field. It is not very difficult to understand the difference between the field and its knower, the body and the knower of the body. Any person can consider that from childhood to old age he undergoes so many changes of body and yet is still one person remaining. Thus, there is a difference between the knower of the field of activities and the actual field of activities. A living conditioned soul can thus understand that he is different from the body. It is described in the beginning, Dehesmin, that the living entity is within the body, and that the body is changing from childhood to boyhood, and from boyhood to youth, and from youth to old age. And the person who owns the body knows that the body is changing. The owner is distinctly Kshetrajana. Sometimes we understand that I am happy, I am mad, I am a woman, I am a dog, I am a cat. These are the knowers. The knower is different from the field. Although we use many articles, our clothes, etc., we know that we are different from the things used. Similarly, we also understand by a little contemplation that we are different from the body. In the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, the knower of the body, the living entity, and the position by which he can understand the Supreme Lord are described. In the middle 6 chapters of the Gita, the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the relationship between the individual soul and the supersoul in regard to devotional service are described. The superior position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the subordinate position of the individual soul are definitely defined in these chapters. The living entities are subordinate under all circumstances, but in their forgetfulness they are suffering. When enlightened by pious activities, they approach the Supreme Lord in different capacities, as the distressed, those in want of money, the inquisitive, and those in search of knowledge. That is also described. Now, starting with the 13th chapter, how the living entity comes into contact with material nature, how he is delivered by the Supreme Lord through the different methods of fruitive activities, cultivation of knowledge, and the discharge of devotional service are explained. Although the living entity is completely different from the material body, he somehow becomes related. This also is explained. Text 3. Kshetra janam chapi mam vidhi sava kshetreshu bharata kshetra janayo janam yatas janam matam mama. Translation. O son of Bharata, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies, and to understand this body and its owner is called knowledge. That is my opinion. Purport. While discussing the subject of this body and the owner of the body, the soul and the supersoul, we shall find 3 different topics of study: the Lord, the living entity, and matter. In every field of activities, in every body, there are 2 souls, the individual soul and the supersoul. Because the supersoul is the plenary expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna says, I am also the knower, but I am not the individual owner of the body. I am the super-knower. I am present in every body as the Paramatma, or supersoul. One who studies the subject matter of the field of activity and the knower of the field very minutely in terms of this Bhagavad Gita can attain to knowledge. The Lord says, I am the knower of the field of activities in every individual body. The individual may be the knower of his own body, but he is not in knowledge of other bodies. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is present as the Supersoul in all bodies, knows everything about all bodies. He knows all the different bodies of all the various species of life. A citizen may know everything about his patch of land, but the king knows not only his palace, but all the properties possessed by the individual citizens. Similarly, one may be the proprietor of the body individually, but the Supreme Lord is the proprietor of all bodies. The king is the original proprietor of the kingdom, and the citizen is the secondary proprietor. Similarly, the Supreme Lord is the supreme proprietor of all bodies. The body consists of the senses. The Supreme Lord is Hrishikesha, which means controller of the senses. He is the original controller of the senses, just as the king is the original controller of all the activities of the state, and the citizens are secondary controllers. The Lord also says, I am also the knower. This means that he is the super-knower. The individual soul knows only his particular body. In the Vedic literature, it is stated as follows: Kshetrani sharirani vijam chapi shubhashubhe aniveti sa yogatma tata kshetra jana uchate. The body is called the kshetra, and within it dwells the owner of the body and the Supreme Lord, who knows both the body and the owner of the body. Therefore, he is called the knower of all fields. The distinction between the field of activities, the owner of activities, and the supreme owner of activities is described as follows. Perfect knowledge of the constitution of the body, the constitution of the individual soul, and the constitution of the supersoul is known in terms of Vedic literature as Jananam. That is the opinion of Krishna. To understand both the soul and the supersoul as one yet distinct is knowledge. One who does not understand the field of activity and the knower of activity is not in perfect knowledge. One has to understand the position of Prakriti, nature, and Purusha, the enjoyer of the nature, and Ishvara, the knower who dominates or controls nature, and the individual soul. One should not confuse the 3 in their different capacities. One should not confuse the painter, the painting, and the easel. This material world, which is the field of activities, is nature, and the enjoyer of nature is the living entity, and above them both is the supreme controller, the personality of Godhead. It is stated in the Vedic language, Okta Vokyam Preritaram Chamatva Savam Proktam Trividham Brahmanita. There are 3 Brahman conceptions. Prakriti is Brahman as the field of activities, and the Jiva, individual soul, is also Brahman and is trying to control material nature. And the controller of both of them is also Brahman, but he is the factual controller. In this chapter, it will be also explained that out of the two knowers, one is fallible and the other is infallible. One is superior and the other is subordinate. One who understands the two knowers of the field to be one and the same contradicts the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who states here very clearly that I am also the knower of the field of activity. One who misunderstands a rope to be a serpent is not in knowledge. There are different kinds of bodies, and there are different owners of the bodies, because each individual soul has its individual capacity of lording it over material nature. There are different bodies. But the Supreme also is present in them as the controller. The word cha is significant, for it indicates the total number of bodies. That is the opinion of Srila Baladev Vidyabhushana. Krishna is the Supersoul present in each and every body, apart from the individual soul. And Krishna explicitly says here that the Supersoul is the controller of both the field of activities and the finite enjoyer. Text 4. Tat keshatram yachcha yadrikcha yarvikari yatascha yat sa chayo yat prabhavascha tat sama sename shrunu. Translation. Now please hear my brief description of this field of activity and how it is constituted, what its changes are, whence it is produced, who that knower of the field of activities is, and what his influences are. Purport. The Lord is describing the field of activities and the knower of the field of activities in their constitutional positions. One has to know how this body is constituted, the materials of which this body is made, under whose control this body is working, how the changes are taking place, wherefrom the changes are coming, what the causes are, what the reasons are, what the ultimate goal of the individual is, and what the actual form of the individual soul is. One should also know the distinction between the individual living soul and the supersoul, the different influences, their potentials, etc. One just has to understand this Bhagavad Gita directly from the description given by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and all this will be clarified. But one should be careful not to consider the Supreme Personality of Godhead in every body and individual soul to be the jiva. This is something like equalizing the potent and the impotent. Text 5. Rishibhi bahuta gitam Chandobi vividi praktak Ramasutra Padesheva Hitumadvi Vinishchitae. Translation. That knowledge of the field of activities and of the knower of activities is described by various sages in various Vedic writings, especially in the Vedanta Sutra, and is presented with all reasoning as to cause and effect. Purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, is the highest authority in explaining this knowledge. Still, as a matter of course, learned scholars and standard authorities always give evidence from previous authorities. Krishna is explaining this most controversial point regarding the duality and non-duality of the soul and the supersoul by referring to scriptures, the Vedanta, which are accepted as authority. First, he says this is according to different sages. As far as the sages are concerned, besides himself, Vyasadeva, the author of the Vedanta Sutra, is a great sage, and in the Vedanta Sutra, duality is perfectly explained. And Vyasadeva's father, Parashara, was also a great sage, and he writes in his books of religiosity, Aham tevam cha atadye. We, you, I, and various other living entities are all transcendental, although in material bodies. Now we are fallen into the ways of the three modes of material nature, according to our different karma. As such, some are on higher levels, and some are in the lower nature. The higher and lower natures exist due to ignorance and are being manifested in an infinite number of living entities. But the Supersoul, which is infallible, is uncontaminated by the three qualities of nature and is transcendental. Similarly, in the original Vedas, a distinction between the soul, the supersoul, and the body is made, especially in the Katha Upanishad. There is a manifestation of the Supreme Lord's energy known as Annamaya, by which one depends simply upon food for existence. This is a materialistic realization of the Supreme. Then there is Pranamaya. This means that after realizing the Supreme Absolute Truth in foodstuff, one can realize the Absolute Truth in the living symptoms, or life forms. In Jnanamaya, the living symptom develops to the point of thinking, feeling, and willing. Then there is Brahman realization and the realization called Vijnanamaya, by which the living entity's mind and life symptoms are distinguished from the living entity himself. The next and supreme stage is Anandamaya, realization of the all-blissful nature. Thus, there are 5 stages of Brahman realization, which is called Brahma Pucham. Out of these, the first 3, Annamaya, Pranamaya, and Jnanamaya, involve the fields of activities of the living entities. Transcendental to all these fields of activities is the Supreme Lord, who is called Anandamaya. In the Vedanta Sutra, also, the Supreme is called Anandamayo Vyasat. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is by nature full of joy, and to enjoy his transcendental bliss, he expands into Vijnanamaya, Pranamaya, Jnanamaya, and Annamaya. In this field of activities, the living entity is considered to be the enjoyer, and different from him is the Anandamaya. That means that if the living entity decides to enjoy in dovetailing himself with the Anandamaya, then he becomes perfect. This is the real picture of the Supreme Lord, as supreme knower of the field, the living entity as subordinate knower, and the nature of the field of activities. Text 6 through 7. Mahabhutan yahankaro buddhi avyaktam evacha indriyani dashekam cha pancha chindriya gocharam ichha divisha sukham dukkam sangatas chetana driti eta kishitram samasena savikaram udaritam. Translation. The 5 great elements, false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms, and convictions, all these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its interactions. Purport. From all the authoritative statements of the great sages, the Vedic hymns, and the aphorisms of the Vedanta Sutra, the components of this world are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. These are the 5 great elements, Mahabhuta. Then there are false ego, intelligence, and the unmanifested stage of the 3 modes of nature. Then there are 5 senses for acquiring knowledge, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and touch. Then 5 working senses, voice, legs, hands, the anus, and the genitals. Then above the senses there is the mind, which is within, and which can be called the sense within. Therefore, including the mind, there are 11 senses altogether. Then there are the 5 objects of the senses, smell, taste, warmth, touch, and sound. Now, the aggregate of these 24 elements is called the field of activity. If one makes an analytical study of these 24 subjects, then he can very well understand the field of activity. Then there is desire, hatred, pleasure, and pain, which are interactions, representations of the 5 great elements in the gross body. The living symptoms represented by consciousness and conviction are the manifestation of the subtle body, mind, ego, and intelligence. These subtle elements are included within the field of activities. The 5 great elements are a gross representation of the subtle false ego. They are a representation in the material conception. Consciousness is represented by intelligence. of which the unmanifested stage is the three modes of material nature. The unmanifested three modes of material nature is called pradhana. One who desires to know the 24 elements in detail along with their interactions should study the philosophy in more detail. In Bhagavad Gita, a summary only is given. The body is the representation of all these factors, and there are changes of the body, which are 6 in number. The body is born, it grows, it stays, it produces byproducts, then begins to decay, and at the last stage it vanishes. Therefore the field is a non-permanent material thing. However, the kshatrajana, the knower of the field, its proprietor, is different.